Welcome to the Peer Review Podcast, Creativity and Fulfillment in Academia.
I'm Sarah Bunin-Benor.
And I'm Mira Sukharov.
In each episode, we interview fellow scholars, coaches, and experts on what makes for a good academic life.
Today, our guest is Lance Eaton.
Dr. Lance Eaton's work engages with the possibility of digital tools for expanding teaching and learning, while considering the various deep issues and questions that educational technologies open up for students, faculty, and higher education as a whole. Lance has a PhD in higher education. He has a dissertation that focuses on academic piracy and scholarly identity. He's given talks, written about, and presented at conferences on artificial intelligence generative tools in education, academic piracy, open access, open educational resources, hybrid flexible learning, and digital service learning. His musings and ramblings on AI and education can be found on his blog, aiedusimplified.substack.com. Lance, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here and for this conversation.
So first, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about your own academic background.
I think I've always been on a non-traditional academic track. I got my bachelor's first, and then I got an associate's because I knew I wanted to stay in education. I knew I was going to get more advanced degrees, but I wasn't mentally ready yet to do a master's. And so I was like, well, what else could I do? So I did an associate's. It was also helpful because it put off paying school loans because I was still taking courses. And then when I did my first master's, I ended up starting to teach very shortly after that. So I got my first master's, it was American Studies, and I started to teach at the community college where I had got my associates from. And in a very short period of time, about 2 years, I was essentially full-time adjuncting. Uh, and while I was doing that, I also picked up another master's in public administration. And I was in this place in the late 2000s where I was teaching between 7 to 9 face-to-face classes a semester, 2 online, and working full-time overnight because I needed health insurance. I don't think the state of adjuncts has changed much in the 15 years since that was going on. I really enjoyed the teaching. Because I was doing all of that, I started to lean on technology in many different ways to make it feasible. And I just recognized and saw at that time, at least for me, the idea of a tenure track position just did not feel real, or it felt like I would be having to spend more money on a degree to then pray I can find a position somewhere, uh, anywhere that had a reasonable income to also support like a life. Um, and so it was at that point I just, I was like, okay, like I can enjoy this teaching. I'm doing these different things. That's great. And it was around that time, and after about 5 or so years, I had taught over 85 classes. About a quarter of those were online, and a position of instructional designer opened up. And that introduced me to this world of like supporting faculty. And the model there very much was instructional designers as coach and as support to the faculty member. So there's lots of different models of instructional design, but this is one that resonated with me where I'm basically sitting next to the faculty and we're having these rich conversations about pedagogy. We're having these rich conversations about like where and when is it appropriate to use, to use this tool or that tool. And so over that time, I also ended up picking up a third master's, which was instructional design. At that point, I started the doctorate and PhD in higher education at UMass Boston. And it was just a really good fit to push my understanding, to see a 30,000-foot view and figure out like what made sense. So this is like mid 2010s, I also start a series of transitions, which initially I was sad to have left North Shore. It was the right time, but I was sad to have left. But it also allowed me to start to gain a lot of experience at different institutions. And so I've been to small liberal arts colleges, research institutions, startup colleges that are 15 years or younger, Ivy League institutions. And so got some really rich experience across those areas while I was finishing my doctorate. and then settled in and recognized, I started in instructional design, but I think where I do my best work is in faculty development. And then so much of my work, both directly day-to-day work, but also work I'll do outside of that, like research and writing and conferences and stuff like that, has been about like, how do we better support that learning space? How do we think about tools, agency, all of these things in these spaces that are also constantly changing for lots of different reasons. I designed my first hybrid flexible class in 2014, so a good 6 years before the pandemic. And I created it because it was a student-driven consideration. I did it as a capstone for my master's because I was running into the situation where at some of the places I taught, I would teach once a week and a student would miss a class. And at the places I taught, particularly students taking evening classes, like have full lives. All students have full lives, but like particularly adult students have a lot of different demands. And it was just killing me where like a student would miss a week and they'd come back the next week and like they'd share that their life had fallen apart. And they're like, what do I do to catch up? And I'm like, the only good answer I really had is like, well, now you've got 2 weeks of stuff to catch up and you miss like the things that went on in class. So the hybrid flexible course was really a very intentional design to think about, well, what happens if you can't get to class? So that set me up well for when the pandemic came to be pretty comfortable. And that probably very similarly happened with AI, is that as it came out, I just started playing with it very publicly. I started sharing results. And then I took a dive, and in January 2023, like bought a course on AI in education with like ChatGPT just out for like, for just over a month. So that's kind of how I come into all of this. It's been a fun and interesting ride.
Wow. Well, the way I first encountered you was through a spreadsheet that you created about AI policies that faculty members around the world that were using. I contributed to that spreadsheet, but my policy is totally up in the air right now because the technologies keep changing and people's adoption of it keep changing. And the more articles I read about students using AI even when they're not supposed to, make me wonder what we should be doing in the classroom right now. So let's turn to that subject. Although we could spend the rest of the time talking about your really interesting career and ideas for people who want to go into teaching instructional design and the kinds of work that you've done. But let's talk about AI. What is your advice?
Gosh, what is my advice? I mean, my advice is like, I guess I can boil it down into a few points. Uh, just start playing with it and play with it until you find something that wows you about it. And like, even if you hate it, use it until it wows you, because even if you never use it, that can help understand, build the empathy, build the thinking that's needed to engage with students and everybody that is finding it really powerful. We can spend all the time we want uh, talking about the problems, and there are many problems to navigate with this, just as like there is with every technology. But if we're not doing that also in a space where we're recognizing some of the affordances that help impact people's lives, I don't think we're being honest brokers as educators.
Okay,
I
so
see that.
let's do that. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the time that it wowed us. I'll
Mhm.
start.
Yeah.
I put in one of my assignments and it generated an excellent paper. And I said, okay, I know that I cannot assign this assignment anymore because even if I say you are on the honor system saying that you don't use AI, or if you do use AI, you have to use it in this way and tell us how you're using it, some students are still going to use it. And so I'm going to change my assignments, but I'm not exactly sure how yet.
Mhm.
Anyway, that was a time that it wowed me. A time that it did not wow me was when I put in a file of data, qualitative interview data, and asked the AI engine to do an analysis of it and give very specific instructions. It came out with what seemed like a great report, an analysis, but it actually made up quotes. It did not use the quotes from my data as I instructed it to do, and it made up quotes. And I was like, "Ooh, that's a great quote. I don't remember that one." And I checked it; it wasn't actually in my data. And so I know it's still a work in progress, as it always will be. But I realized that I can't use it for my research, and well, that's not true. I realized that there are problems with using it for my research, and anytime I use it, I need to be careful and verify what it says. I also realized that it's very powerful and that people are going to use it in ways that I don't think are appropriate. But what about you, Mira? What's the time that AI wowed you?
Well, I use it in between therapy sessions, and then I gloat by reading to my real therapist what AI said, and try to then the therapy becomes, what am I really trying to do here? What do I need from this therapy? Anyway, that's sort of a joke, but I do use it for personal advice, reflection. I mean, the way I think about it is sort of, people say journal. Well, imagine you had a journal that actually talked back. That's what it's like to me. Okay, so that's great. To me, AI is a butler. And students aren't supposed to have butlers doing their work for them. So, two things: how do we assess writing and assess the acquisition of knowledge aside from pencil and paper tests and exams in class? And second, should we still be teaching writing? I developed a whole course on how to teach op ed writing, but an AI does quite a decent job at writing op eds. Do students still need to learn to write or not?
Mm.
And
Fun
maybe I'll
question.
just say, are we even asking the wrong questions? Because I keep asking these questions and I'm waiting for someone like you, Lance, to say you're asking the wrong questions. So that's an option too.
All right. Whew. Sarah, to your point, one of the questions I lean into is just to start as a warm up is the question of like, tell me about a time when AI did you wrong. I learned this one and I really like it because there is this recognition of it's a mediocre tool and sometimes does things that wow us, and sometimes, I spend 5 minutes arguing with it to top a line cable, right? Like like it's just gaslighting me. It is a mediocre tool. Um, and using it to do qualitative data is I'll be curious to go back to that experiment time, every 6 months to see what those results are because it's also changing. For education, that question of, how do we assess writing? How do we assess acquisition of knowledge? Should we still be teaching writing? Like some of the things that I do teach is literature and writing, and I consider myself a writer. And I think this is going to be one of the really harder transitions because we've got to do it all at once. Is like we've just got to think about what the teaching and learning is going to look different. There's this myth we have that, classrooms haven't changed, there's still lecture based, blah, blah, blah. And there's some that are, but like I can look at the span of my life and I know like I I I actually even know on a physical level, like the classrooms I went to in college when I came back a decade later to teach were different, right? Not only was like there the projector and the laptop or computer console, but there were tables instead of chairs. Like there's been this change in expectation that comes with it. We are at a point today where it is almost inconceivable that the vast majority of educators could teach their classes and have expectations of their students being able to follow along if all of a sudden the internet died, if we had no digital technology. I use that as a good metaphor of like, there's so many things, so many new assumptions and changes that we have moved from. Like, I can say it's been well over a decade since I've physically handed out a syllabus. There's just so many things that have changed in our classroom over the last 20 or 30 years that like were small and incremental and happened over time. And the challenge is that AI is asking us to make all of these changes at once if we don't even know what the changes need to be. So I don't think those are the wrong questions. I think it's the only way to figure that out is through. And that makes us really rightfully uncomfortable. That makes us uncomfortable because we're experimenting. Even though the truth is, whenever we're teaching, by and large, we're experimenting. We have science that shows us there's things that may work better, but there's almost nothing we're ever doing in teaching that we certifiably know works for all students. And so it's always an experiment. It's always a like something we're working through as humans in relations with students. And that's the way through, is figuring it out with students. And that was part of, for me, why I ended up like doing what I did in January of 2023, which is like, I'm going to have a lot better insight if I'm figuring this out with students. And so that course on AI in education was exactly that. It was an attempt to say, okay, let's figure this out. ChatGPT is a month old. How do we think about this? And in the where I was teaching it, College Unbound, it's a largely adult population. And so I got to work with students who were parents, who paraprofessionals in education and in healthcare, and start to think about the different ways this shows up, what this might mean. And actually within that course, we crafted the institutional policy, the institutional usage policy for faculty and students, that we ended up also like piloting and trying out and then getting approved. But I really think, to me, that's like, I think whatever the answer is to how do we assess writing and acquisition of knowledge, it's going to be figured out with students. And it's going to have to be figured out in the individual disciplines, because for some disciplines, writing is rightfully super important. And for other disciplines, functionally reading and writing is essential, but to the degree that it has historically been expected, it may not be as relevant to certain disciplines.
That's interesting. I'm thinking about what is lost if we as scholars use AI for our writing and our research. And I think so much is lost, but I want to just take a step back to 1999, let's say, when I used card catalogs and
Mm,
or maybe 1997, I don't know, but I there was a transition where I no longer used card catalogs for my research. The library system was online, and eventually I got to a place where I don't usually need to get physical copies of books. I do sometimes if they're not available, but most of the reading that I do is digital now, and I love that. I've never heard a professor say, "Ugh, I wish I could go back to the time of card catalogs." But I do hear professors talking about how they don't like to read books online, and they like the hard copies, and they want to keep the libraries. And I personally don't feel that way. I'm a futurist. I like these future technologies, but I'm not yet fully on board with AI for my research, because I actually like doing research and I like writing. And when I asked a particular AI platform to do a certain analysis for me, it did an okay job for part of it, but then I looked through it and I started editing it, and then I realized, you know what, I can do this better. My analysis is going to be more nuanced, but I also really like doing the analysis. It's taking away from me something that I love to do. So that's when I decided that, at least for now, I'm not going to use AI for that kind of research. What about you, Mira? Do you have a similar experience, or do you just use it for everything now?
Well, I've been working on a large grant proposal this month, and I asked the coordinator what are the rules for AI use for this grant proposal, and they pointed me to the rules, and all it said was researchers or grant applicants are responsible, or AI use, colon, researchers are responsible for what is in there. So in other words, I can use AI, but just make sure that AI isn't hallucinating things and therefore I'm responsible. So I started with AI to try to generate a research question. You know, it was very interesting. The research question AI generated was quite soft. It's about peace building and normalization, different forms of dialogue in Israeli-Palestinian norms circles. And it wasn't, the research question they came up with wasn't simply, does it work, does it not? It was, why do some people mobilize anti-normalization or boycott? Why do some people resist? Why? It was quite mushy, but I was like, okay, that sounds good. It sounds quite good. And when I handed in the draft, my grant facilitator, sort of Lance, your counterpart, but for research, same idea, to coach professors, said, this research question is just way too soft. It's way too mushy. And I agree. I could see why she thought that. And so that was a good example of why AI might not be always the best for guiding, but it was very good for methodology. I mean, I hate grant writing, right? Many of us do. So I guess the things that we find unpleasant are the things we're going to want to pass off to AI. And Sarah, you said there's things you really enjoy doing, part of research that you enjoy doing, and you won't want to pass off that to AI.
Yeah, I mean, I'm somebody deeply steeped in AI, and the ways that I use it in writing are not the ways people might expect. People can read through my writing and clearly tell I don't use it for cleaning up. Like I'm comfortable with my writing being a little messy. That's just I'm comfortable with stuff that's on my Substack or my blog being like, oh yeah, there's an error there. I did not clean that up. But one of the ways I use it a lot now is I'll turn on the voice activation. One of the things I have is a paid version of ChatGPT. I turn on the voice version and I tell it, you know, give it a sense of what it is I want to do. So maybe it's I want to write an article, maybe it's I want to, work on the arc of an upcoming talk or whatnot. So I give it that stuff and I tell it to interview me and to keep asking me questions based on what I'm saying and what my larger goals are. And so I can do this while I'm on a walk, while I'm doing dishes, while I'm just here in the office. And we'll go back and forth like that for, 10, 15 minutes. And then everything that I've said is now here on the phone in my chat log, which means when I go onto my computer, I have that text and I can start to take that text and start to now shape it. And because of that questioning, because I've given it certain information about who I am and the, kind of my approaches, like it has a good sense of what to ask to help me make that happen. So I use it in that way. And for me, to your point, Sarah, like it doesn't take away from the writing. Like it gets me into it quicker and deeper in more exciting ways because I love writing. I've been doing it since I was like 10 years old. And also like when I'm staring at the white page, I'm staring at the white page and, just like, well, how do I start this? One of the series that I'm working on writing on that Substack is, I just defended my dissertation back in December and I want to write like how I would have approached each chapter were AI present when I started. And basically like talk about this is what I think would be the appropriate way where I wouldn't lose, but I would gain. Because also for me, my dissertation journey took a decade. I started the program in 2015 and I finished this year, just walked in May. And so looking at and knowing why some of that was and some of the things that felt overwhelming, um, I would look at that's my plan is to think about how would AI have been able to support that, but not necessarily replace that learning.
Wow, that sounds great. I want to read that. So you mentioned that you have a Chat GPT paid account.
Mhm.
And do you also use other AI platforms?
Yeah, right now I bounce across ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini predominantly. I find Claude and ChatGPT to be the best, and Google's Gemini is getting a lot better, but it's also I want to be aware of Google because unlike the other two, my my bet, if I were my bet or my crystal ball, um, I think at some point, like your Google, less so I think Microsoft, although Microsoft might within business entities, but I think Google will become a much bigger player because so much about what can really make AI work well is context. And for good and bad reasons, Google has the most context about all of us that it could it could be very well situated to be able to be most responsive and figure out what we mean better than I think what ChatGPT or Claude will, just because, for some of us, I mean, I've had a Google account almost 20 years, right? And
Yeah.
so there's all sorts of like I'm not ignoring like there's problems about all of that information gathering that they're doing, and also that could make a significant difference in how it understands how I am in different digital contexts.
Yeah, well, let's talk about those ethical issues. So I know that there are a lot of criticisms of AI and specifically certain companies for their unethical practices of collecting data and ignoring copyright, and also there are environmental concerns. How do you incorporate that understanding into the advice that you give people about using AI?
Yeah. Um, on the copyright piece, my personal view is probably more radical, because of the fact that my dissertation focused on academic piracy. And at the center of that is the fact that we've created this knowledge structure where, you know, scholars are supposed to be paid by higher ed to produce research. They produce that research and they give it away to publishers, and publishers turn around and sell it back to higher ed at unaffordable rates. And one of the big things within my study was that, there were people from across academia and independent scholars who like needed to rely on places like Sci-Hub and LibGen in order to be scholars. Like that was language out of their mouths of, if I don't have access to Sci-Hub, I can't keep up in my field because my libraries don't have the resources, my institution doesn't have the resources. I had representation from like across all of higher ed up through Ivy League institutions. So there's something profoundly wrong in our society when like so much of research is funded with public dollars that then disappears into private hands, and that the people in, again, had people saying this in the study, the people who produce the research at times couldn't even access it, may not have even gotten copies, or if once they've lost copies, never able to get back. So the more radical version of me just sees like we have something profoundly wrong with how copyright exists. Uh, there's no reason why works of Einstein should still be behind paywalls, right? Ernest Hemingway's work is still behind paywalls, right? There's this huge, because works don't enter public domain until 70 years after the death of the author. There's just this huge, vast amount of knowledge that companies by and large profit off of. So I have a lot of questions, concerns, and issues about that, that to me, what these companies did, which is many of them went and raided Sci-Hub and LibGen and like grabbed that and used it to inform their models, which they then have made free to everybody. Like there is something about, I'm not saying they're not profiting from it. I'm not saying they're not getting data from it and stuff like that, but there is something about that is like, that's, people are now able to access the common culture in ways that just they were not able to prior to ChatGPT, so or any of these AI tools. So there's a part of me that's kind of like, my hopes is like as this goes through the courts, we have to reinvent and rethink what copyright is. So that's the radical version of me. The person who also has like is a little more realistic, a little more grounded. I do think this opens up some really good questions that always happens with newer technology. This every time we have had a new technology emerge, we get these new questions about the nature of copyright. It happened in the 1990s and early 2000s with the Digital Millennial Copyright Act. We saw it emerge with television. We saw it emerge with film, with radio, with sheet music. And so there is something to be said of like, it is tension. It's ethical until it's not, which isn't a great answer, but because so much of this is tied up in legal and corporate profits by lots of different people, that question of ethics is dubious, because a lot of entities wanting to hold on to that are wanting to hold on to that so that they can profit more after already holding on to a hoard of copyright that probably should be back in the culture. So I think there's interesting questions there. And then also I feel deeply for, the individuals that are going to be impacted by this, because the way these tools work. And, as we look at uh, artists and photographers and, other and writers as well, of like how this is going to impact them. And that's also just been part of that's a trend line that has already been happening. And so I'm not saying that excuses it, but like, I mean, to try to be a professional writer in 2025. Um, it was really hard to do back in the early 2000s. I can't imagine how much harder or how smaller of a pool that is. And also there's lots of other like careers that are adjacent to that have emerged. We don't think about it, but we certainly, your content writers for different platforms have emerged as these newer careers that didn't exist 20 years ago. It challenges me, and also there's a little bit of me that's like, ooh, I have hopes that this will like make us have to rethink what copyright is.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know in your bio, you mentioned that you do a lot with open access, open
Mm,
pedagogy, that kind of thing. So it makes sense that you have this approach, especially in relation to your work on piracy. But let's turn back to teaching. And what advice do you have for faculty? Obviously, they should check your spreadsheet with the different policies that faculty around the world are using. But what is your advice for a class that is not about AI, that is about, let's say, the humanities or social sciences? What kind of policies do you recommend that faculty instate?
I I think it starts, the instructional designer with me is like it starts with the outcomes and what are those outcomes and what makes sense in the age of AI, like where will it make sense, or where will it make sense to think about the new assessments that have to happen or that feel more authentic to the students. Because again, as we get introduced to these technologies, some things feel less and less relevant. And so thinking about what will feel authentic to the students, what will feel more authentic as an assessment. And I think this is another piece of the puzzle, which is one of the things we have done historically is we have defaulted to the things that are scalable, that are, and I put this in air quotes, easiest. So tests and papers are easiest to scale, easiest to grade. I'm not saying it's easy to grade papers, but in terms of all the different ways we could assess, it's probably the mass produced easiest. As we emerge into an age which that can be bypassed, it does require us to think more authentically, what might this look like? What can this look like? So really start to build those lateral thinking, those lateral thinking skills of, well, what might this look like instead of a paper? How might I still get the analysis that I'm looking for? Does analysis always have to be written, or can it appear in different ways? So I think I think there's a lot of that, and then there is like co-creating that policy with students for the classroom, and helping to understand where they're coming from, helping to understand where they might be using it in a way that's actually really helpful, even if our initial gut instinct is like, no, I didn't do that, so therefore you must not do that. One of the things that in working and talking with students, had a student who, used AI to organize her notes, and through that found like she could start writing the paper sooner rather than like the night before. And there's going to be some folks who are like, yeah, but that's an important process. But it's not an important process if like that's the thing that's in your way from doing the thing that you're actually going to be graded on. And so therefore you don't touch it until the night before, and then you do the mad dash paper writing, uh, only to squeak by with a C. Versus, oh, I got my paper in a week early because I got through that hurdle and could actually focus on the writing of it. Right. So the student wasn't write my paper, but like, here's my notes. Can you organize them? Because just the way her mind worked, they weren't organized. And this was an adult. She knew she was never going to be a notes organizer. Um, so I think keeping open the opportunity to learn from students about how they're using it, that can be helpful both for offering to other students or just how you're constructing that class, and where that might lead you to think about, well, then what might be the new interesting thing or different thing that feels right with AI. And then the final thing, and this I think is going to be the hardest, is because of its ubiquitousness, because it is everywhere. I don't know that any class cannot have some element of thinking about AI. I I don't like being like it's here kind of thing, but the more I see of how quickly it's grabbed hold in society, the more it reminds me of the internet. And the more it reminds me of that, the more I think about, again, that idea of like, you can't not have a class that doesn't directly and indirectly include the internet. There's no discipline that doesn't function differently because of the internet. And so really the final piece of advice is to really start diving into how is this tool or set of tools being used in your discipline? Where is it showing up? How are people thinking about its use? I started collecting about 2 years ago articles on AI in education. I had to stop in just the last 2.5 years. You can go to Google Scholar, you can check this. There's been over 26,000 articles on AI in education. I have no doubt there's a lot of crap in there. There's a lot of AI generated stuff in there. Like I have no doubt about that. But there's also a lot of stuff across a lot of disciplines that is out there that people are starting to talk about. And so I think that's the final piece of advice is to like dig into what's going on in your discipline around how this is showing up. And then think from there, what are the implications for how I teach?
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to get back to what you said about what will feel authentic to students in terms of
Mm.
assessments. Do you mean that you're looking for something that will feel authentic in the age of AI, that they wouldn't be able to use AI to generate?
Both that idea of like it feels like it's something that AI isn't going to do. So like their human value, but also is closer to the thing that they would be doing in the world. And so in some cases, it's simulations and the like around, for some disciplines, it's much clearer. Nursing is a good example. Like I've seen health professions in general using these AI tools as creating simulations to practice interaction, to practice protocols, to in other fields, legal, practice debating, business, practice, launching your business and running into for others, and this is in the humanities, it gets a little harder because often it's the thing itself, right? Like reading is like in I do think that's where it gets a little bit of this is where like for myself when I now teach like I'm gonna use AI and what I'm going to do is like draw out the contrast of what the AI has and what the human does. How do we look at a text? How does AI look at a text? What is there to learn from AI and what is there that we can't learn from AI? And like keep drilling into that to reinforce what the students themselves have to offer, um, and what a community has to offer. Because I think that's the other piece is, you know, you, at least not yet, you can't bring in 5 or 6 different AIs to have a quote unquote conversation, but you can with students and what happens in that space. And there and again, it's not just the reading that happens, it's the relationships, it's the meaning making across we're doing right here in this podcast that is the thing that has to be really elevated to help students understand like there's also plenty of value in meaning making happening among humans.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think for my assignments for the upcoming semester, I am going to change my written assignments to interview assignments where the students
Mm,
interview each other. And you talked about what's scalable and easy, and it's not scalable and easy to grade recorded interviews in the same way as it is. I can't just read it quickly. I have to listen. I mean, I don't like to listen at double speed. I know some students do, and some of my colleagues as well. But anyway, it's harder for me, right? It's more time consuming. Ideally, it would be oral exams that I would do oral exams for each student. I think that might be impractical, but maybe that's the best way to go. What do you think about all that?
I mean, I love the idea of students interviewing one another. I certainly have done in my asynchronous courses, like structures like that. Uh, and I think it's worth, thinking about the tool. To me, I would go to what's a tool that you could use that you could actually have blend of the audio and the transcript. And help them understand that like part of this is the importance of them having the conversation. And you're going to review it, but it doesn't mean you will listen to every word, but like you're going to listen to chunks of it, you're going to review the transcript. And that becomes a little, that helps them know they don't have to get things perfect. And it also doesn't put you entirely on the hook for listening to all of it. I like if I'm being transparent with students around that, like I would feel comfortable framing it that way. That may not be the case for you. The oral exams piece, I guess I generally like the idea of having students do more than just the written word. And I also think about, is it just them? Like, I think to me, my mind goes to what does that look like? And is it people doing talks in class? Is it people doing recordings? Is there peer review process? Like, I think there's a lot of possibilities there. I think there's a lot of, when I think of, oh gosh, what was that tool? Voice threads. Like, I think there's some cool things for us to be thinking of. Voice threads was a really cool tool that you could have like video and audio chats. And so doing something along those lines where like people are responding to one another, basically like a telephone line of like people responding, but also building their response and demonstrating their understanding and moving it forward to the next person. Like I think there's some really cool creative things that also mimic the world we live in, where you get told by somebody about a project that you have to work on, you're starting to move it along, think about it, etc. You're moving it on to the next person, so there's things they have to know. Finding those ways that it feels a little more grounded in them and a little more like reflective of what happens in the world.
Thank you. Lance, Eaton, this has been a really enlightening conversation. I'm going to take away so many ideas for how to incorporate AI into my teaching and how to change my assignments to reflect the reality that everyone is going to be using AI. And so thank you for your wisdom and for all the great work that you do.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, Lance.
The Peer Review podcast is produced and hosted by Sarah Bunin-Benor and Mira Sukarov. Talia Ehrenberg is assistant producer and editor. The music is written and performed by the Galactic Ambassadors. Support for this podcast comes from a faculty grant from Hebrew Union College. If you would like to sponsor an episode, you can reach us at peerreview@huc.edu. You can join the conversation on Facebook at Peer Review, Cultivating Creativity and Fulfillment in Academia. Thank you for listening.